Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Scattered Books book banter talk with Fiona Davis and Julie Satow. I'm Laura, and this is Kimberly. We're both from Scattered Books, and these are the books we're
Sorry.
discussing. And I'm going to turn it over to Kimberly to moderate.
So Julie and Fiona, thank you so much for being here. I just want to do a little brief blurb about each of you, and then we can move to the questions if that's okay.
Sure. Great.
So Julie Satow is an award-winning journalist who has covered real estate in New York City for more than a decade. She's a regular contributor to the New York Times. Her work has been featured on NPR, Huffington Post, New York Post, and elsewhere. She's a graduate of Columbia University's School of International Affairs. Fiona Davis is the New York Times bestselling author of 5 novels, including The Dollhouse, The Masterpiece, and most recently, The Lions of Fifth Avenue. She lives in New York City and South Salem, and is a graduate of the College of William and Mary in Virginia and Columbia University School of Journalism. Obviously, the books we are discussing today are about iconic and landmark buildings in New York City. Ms. Satow previously wrote about real estate and the history of New York buildings prior to penning The Plaza, and Mrs. Davis has consistently focused on various quintessential New York architecture that has historical significance, including Lions of Fifth Avenue. Within less than 20 blocks of each other, one inspired by a French Renaissance chateau and the other created in the Beaux-Arts architectural style, these two edifices are known around the world. So thank you, ladies, for being with us today. I so appreciate it. Laura and I were so excited about this.
No, thanks for having us. This is great.
I'm glad we finally managed to do it.
Exactly. So I'd love to know, just to start from each of you, what drew you to write about these landmarks? Julie, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. So, I moved to New York City when I was 15, and we lived not too far from Central Park, and I went to high school right around Central Park, so we'd always hang out there. And the Plaza is this enormous white glittering facade that sort of overshadows Central Park. So I always kind of stared at it, and it was always this wonderful place that I imagined such glamour and glitz happened inside it. And when in like 2005, 2006, I was working as a journalist, and I covered the story of the Plaza when it was converted largely into apartments, which was a really big story at the time in New York.
Mm-hmm.
It involved unions, and the mayor got involved, and it was a huge to-do when it was converted, just because it was such a sort of landmark building in New York. So that was a massive transition. And so I covered the story then. And then when it was time to get married, I looked at lots of places, and I was lucky enough to have my reception at the Plaza. So I had all these sort of connections with it. So when I was thinking about writing a book, I was looking at various ideas, and I started to think about, possibly the Plaza made sense. And as I started looking more into it, I realized no one had written a history rather, of the building since like the 1960s. And so much had happened there. And I really realized that beside my personal connection, so many people have a connection there. And it really is kind of this perfect vehicle to tell sort of larger social history of New York over, 100+ years. So I really felt like, it was the perfect symbol to really hang my book on. So
Brilliant. I love the fact that it goes back to when you were a child. That's amazing.
Yeah. I think a lot of New Yorkers have memories probably of the hotel, shopping in Midtown and stopping in at the bathroom, or tea in the Palm Court. So, that makes, right. They had great bathrooms. So
They did. My grandmother actually took me for high tea when I was probably in my early teens. And I remember her saying, we have to go to the bathroom. And it wasn't really so much that we had to, it was more you had to see the gold and the opulence, and yeah.
Right, exactly. So, it was really, I love the fact that the hotel is sort of a building for the people. It's like the Empire State Building or the Brooklyn Bridge in terms of its fame, but unlike those structures, it's a place that so many people have personal connections with. So that really makes it, so wonderful.
Yes, terrific. And Fiona, what was the New York Public Library a landmark that you had thought about writing about for years, or was this a new idea for you?
Yeah, so all my books are set in these landmark New York
Yeah.
City buildings, like the Barbizon Hotel for Women or Grand Central.
Right.
And the idea for this one actually came from my readers, where I have been giving author talks around the country for my other books. And at every talk, people would come up to me and say, "Oh, what about this building?" or "What about that one?" Because people who've been to New York or lived in New York, everyone has their favorite building.
Mhm.
And the New York Public Library just came up over and over and over. And, I loved libraries. When I was a kid, we moved around a lot. And the one thing that was always constant was going to the library once a week with my mom and my brother, getting books. My brother would get books on trains. I would get ones on horses. We'd jump in the car and go back and read. And that kind of helped quell my anxiety at being in a new school or, a new state. And so I thought, well, that could be interesting, the New York Public Library, but I really wasn't sure because, it's a building full of books.
Mhm.
And how can you kind of make that come alive in a historical fiction novel? And I started doing research, and I'm always looking for the surprises. That's when I know the book will work. And as I did research, I came upon this article from 1941 about the retirement of the superintendent at the library. And it talked about how he had lived with his wife and 3 children in an apartment deep inside the library, a 7-room apartment, for 30 years. He'd been there since the library opened. And it talked about how his daughter had been born in the library, and how his son had raised pigeons on the roof. And suddenly I thought, oh, this can work. A family living in the library, that's perfect. And so what I do is I kind of take that non-fictional inspiration and create a fictional story around it.
I love that. And the public library is, one of the best. I would say the Plaza, the public library. There's only 4 or 5 buildings that, to me, represent New York City, and everybody on the planet knows. But I remember growing up and seeing Patience and Fortitude, the lions in front of the library. Really wrapped with wreaths at Christmas, and now they have masks on them.
Yes.
But that bit about the apartment in the library, as someone who also grew up going to libraries, and obviously I love being around books, I would kill to be able to live in an apartment in a library. That would just be, and the stacks and the basement and everything.
Oh, just to be able to explore. I was able to get behind the scenes and see the space, and now you can still see where all the rooms were, but it's now offices and storage. But, I always joke around that they should make it into an Airbnb, and it would do so well.
Absolutely.
I should say, Fiona, I wrote my whole book basically at the New York Public Library. So I feel like it's it is such an inspiring space, and I remember, I don't know if you ever visited, there's the Allen Room.
Yes, that's where I wrote this book.
Oh, yeah, okay, so I think maybe we talked about that. So
Yeah.
I was in the Allen Room, which is sort of a room set aside for people working, writing books. And while I was there, one of the books that I relied on, well, several of the books I relied on was Frederick Allen's books. He was a historian, and he wrote about the Depression and the 1920s Jazz Age. So it was just it so shows you how the books are just so alive too, almost their own characters.
Absolutely. I would get books on the history of the construction of the library or typhoid. And with the Allen Room, you can get them, you request them, and they show up at your bookshelf the next time you visit. And it's this room it's not very large, but there's a lot of cubicles and wooden desks, and it's so silent. If you turn a page too loudly, you get worried that someone will shush you. It's a very serious room. But it was so cool to be working on a book about the library in the library. That was half the fun.
Right, that is so meta. That's awesome. Yeah.
And I love the overlap. It's not just that you both attended Columbia at different times, but that you both wrote your books within the same room at different times.
True.
That's absolutely
true.
incredible.
Yeah, I think we both have this love of New York history, and we're curious what these buildings, the layers of history that are hidden in these buildings, and the kind of ghosts that have wandered the halls over time. I think we're both really enraptured in that. And if you live in New York long enough, you've passed by so many buildings and wonder, you know, what happened in there.
Right.
And so as a researcher, to be able to ask that question and get it answered is just the best.
Yes, that's so true. I mean, I have such envy though for the way Fiona gets to do it, because she can just let her imagination soar. And if the actual reality isn't quite as great as you hoped it to be, you know, you have full freedom to kind of make it really dramatic, which sometimes I'm quite jealous of. But I will tell you, if anyone is familiar with, you know, the area around the library, if you go down the stairs of the library and you turn right, the next block over on Fifth Avenue, there's a placard there, this gold placard, and it actually is it has its own really interesting history. So it just, anyway, I can tell you the story. It's basically the original real estate magnate. It's his family who used to live there, and it's this really fascinating story about the Wendells. They were very eccentric, this very eccentric real estate family, but it just shows you that like every little nook and cranny has some sort of history behind it. So I concur.
I love that. And then on top of that, you know, in that same spot in the 1800s was this huge reservoir, the Croton Reservoir, which supplied all the drinking water to New York City. And it had 50-foot high granite walls and a promenade that you could walk around. And that's where the library is now. And in fact, they use some of the granite stones in the foundation of the library, which you can see if you're inside. Look at us geeking out. Like, here we go.
Sorry, it's so random.
It's over.
We'll let you ask questions. Sorry.
No, please keep going. This is amazing. I didn't know there was a plaque there at all.
Yeah, it's really interesting. They were called the Weird Wendells, the family, and they were this like family. They were incredibly rich, like super, super rich, but they lived like paupers, and you know, with lots of cats and weird eccentric things in their house that was falling down. But they owned all the property around, but not obviously the Croton Reservoir. But interestingly, the plaza was also it was a pond before the plaza, so there was water there too originally.
Wow. Because right across the street in the park, there's a pond. So it must have been all one kind of system.
Yes.
Okay. All right. You can ask us questions now.
No, I mean, I'm happy to ask questions, but I love, you know, the things that I'm learning, that we're all learning tonight from both of you is just incredible. I will ask this, since we've already talked about patience and fortitude, and there's also the Pulitzer Fountain in front of the plaza. I love the idea of the Pulitzer Fountain, which has a statue of Pomona, who's the Roman goddess of abundance, which seems appropriate for the plaza.
Appropriate.
I mean, right? And then you've got these gorgeous lions in front of the New York Public Library. Anything, I'm just going to be very vague because I'd rather hear your stories. Anything you want to share about those incredible statues in front of your buildings, ladies?
I mean, sure. I'll say, you know, the fact that it's set back, the plaza, and it does have kind of this fountain there, that was a very integral part of the design, but also the way that the plaza sort of evoked glamour and space. I mean, which is such a premium in New York. And, you know, you were able to see it from far away. You could really see the full facade rather than being so up close how you are with most buildings. And obviously the fountain, I mean, it played many roles. I mean, F. Scott Fitzgerald is probably the most famous story, which it's apocryphal. I could never quite figure out if it was accurate or not, but obviously he was intoxicated one day and jumped into the fountain with Zelda and sort of celebrated New York. But, you know, when the Beatles came, that was where all the fans, you know, tons of the Beatlemania, all the teeny boppers were in, you know, Pulitzer Fountain around there, just screaming their heads off, waiting to see, you know, the Beatles through the window. So it's an integral part of the building, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and for me, you know, patience and fortitude are known by their names, but as I did research, I learned that they were named Leo Astor and Leo Lennox at first, and in fact, the public reaction to them when they were first put on their pedestals was horror. People thought they were really ugly. They thought they were a cross between a Dachshund and a rabbit. They were not well received. And then later, of course, they're now beloved, and Mayor LaGuardia named them after Depression era values, patience and fortitude, after the Depression. But the funny thing about Pulitzer Fountain, there's two things. One is Joseph Pulitzer founded the Columbia Journalism School, which is where my character Laura in the book gets accepted to and attends in the 1914s. And then on top of that, the statue on top, Pomona, the model for that was a woman named Audrey Munson, who was known as the supermodel of her time in the Gilded Age. And she posed for, dozens and dozens of statues all over the city. On the Brooklyn Bridge, on the corner of Columbus Circle. She's on the New York Public Library. She's everywhere. And she led this scandalous life and then disappeared. And in fact, my next book is set at the Frick collection. And above their doorway is this kind of stone carving of a woman naked lying in profile. She's kind of lying on her side. And that was also Audrey Munson. And so that book is all about what if Audrey Munson got a job as the private secretary to one of the Fricks when she was trying to escape her scandalous life. And that's my next book. So it all comes full circle.
It's very, very intertwined.
Yes.
I think that's incredible. And the Frick is another beloved building for me and many of us. And I can't wait to hear more about that. That's amazing. And I had no idea that she had posed for so many of these statues.
Yeah, she's everywhere in New York, everywhere.
It's incredible.
And led a terribly tragic life, which is a journalist or a novelist, that's what you're looking for.
Of course. Both of you sort of briefly touched on the fact that, one of these books is nonfiction and one is historical fiction. I have to say, I go between, I love reading both historical fiction and nonfiction, but I learned so much from Lions of Fifth Avenue that your research is impeccable. And it's just, to me, so much fun to read and learn at the same time. And then Julie, when I read your book, parts of it really read like fiction. And so it's, I'm learning, and obviously your research is incredible. And you have the knowledge base, but it really does. There are parts of it that you think, oh my God, could this really have happened?
I definitely felt that way. Talk about like tragic stories and crazy stories. One of the first women, there was a whole slew of women who lived at the Plaza and sort of, it was their home, not really, they weren't, transient hotel guests. And one of the first was this Russian princess who came in 1909. And she literally, according to all the newspaper articles and the research I did, she actually showed up with a family of owls, an alligator, she had an ibis, I don't know, all kinds of animals that I didn't even know what they were. I had to check. And, she's quite famous for actually, while she was living at the Plaza, she went to the Bronx Zoo and fell in love with, or rather Ringling Brothers Circus, and fell in love with the lion. And she brought the lion back to the hotel and she had it living in her bathtub of her hotel suite. And I was like, really, is this actually accurate? But you can, she actually, the hotel after a few months insisted that she give the lion away, and she did give it to the Bronx Zoo, and it's buried in Westchester. So actually not far from you guys, there's a pet cemetery. So it is true, but I agree. It sort of reads like crazy fiction. And then sadly, she, at World War I, all her money disappeared, her mysterious money. Supposedly she was the lover of the German Kaiser. So she ended up dying a pauper, and it was very sad, and not at the Plaza. So somewhat similar, not exactly, but similar too.
And when Julie's book came out, she'd written kind of a shorter article about the women who all lived there, which you'll have to talk about because they're wonderful. But it was this wonderful article about this kind of coterie of crazy ladies. And that day, I got so many emails from people who'd seen it saying, you should write about this next. But again, the way you write it, it feels like fiction because you're on this journey and you have character arcs that you kind of follow through.
But at the same time, and by the way, they were called the 39 Widows of the Plaza, and they although there was like 200 of them, so I have no idea like why that's what they were called. But yes, but interestingly, I mean, rather the other way also happens where you hope it's going to be like fiction and amazing, and then you hit these dead ends. So that was like very, very frustrating, and that especially happened with the more historical stuff. When the Plaza first opened in that 1907, 1910, that era. For instance, I really wanted to be able to write about the people who worked at the Plaza and what it was like to be a waiter or a housekeeper or whatever, taking care of all these fabulous guests. And there just wasn't a lot written at the time about people who worked at a hotel, right? That wasn't what people really covered. So, I found a few things, but it's frustrating. So those are the kind of things that, Fiona can take it and run with. So, yeah.
And that's where, for me, digging into the history is really helpful because I could take it and play with it. Like for the Lions of Fifth Avenue, I knew I wanted to have a rare book theft be part of the mystery that drives the story forward. And the New York Public Library isn't a circulating library. It's a research library. So you can't take anything out. And things are very carefully guarded. Especially the really valuable rare books. And so I started doing research and found this book theft that happened at Columbia University's Butler Library in 1994, where a thief stole $1.8 million of rare books over the course of 3 months. And no one could figure out how he was getting in and out. And it's an incredible story that an author wrote a whole book about. And I realized it could apply very easily to my library and my family there. And so I was able to just take that and run with it and use details from that in my book without having to footnote them or anything. I know I make sure that any research that I use, I credit in the author's note. But for you to have to stick to exactly what the facts are, that's tough.
I will say, I mean, because you are a journalist, were a journalist, I guess not anymore, but that training and on all your research, I mean, it's so integral to what you're doing. Like for obviously, as they were saying, like you just learn so much reading it because the history is so accurate and the research gives so much depth to the story. So, and it gives it a real feeling of, authenticity that I think if you just were completely making it up whole cloth, it wouldn't translate as well. So.
Yeah, I think for both of our books, like for you, there are parts of it that just read like, that can't be true, and it is. And with me, there are parts that read, that must be true, and it's not.
Right.
Exactly. That's a good way to put it.
But even I remember one of the first things that struck me when I was reading The Plaza, and I don't know why it stuck with me, but I think it's at the beginning of the book, and you talk about when they're doing the ironwork and they're throwing the hot nails, right? And
molten metal, yes.
Right, the molten metal, and they purposefully dropped it at certain men's feet because it was a union job.
Yeah,
and they had
Yeah, this was one of the stories that I just was like so psyched about. So we didn't talk about how we do our research, but I could talk a little bit about,
Please.
So at the public library, and thankfully because of the public library, I had access to these amazing digital archives of old newspapers. So, imagine like in the olden, when we were in, I don't know, when I was in high school or even college, you had to use microfiche, to find things. So you needed to know the date and essentially what you were looking for to be able, because otherwise you're just searching a needle in a haystack. You're just searching through newspapers, randomly looking for stories. But now, the New York Public Library has this amazing digital archive. So it essentially operates like Google. I could put in the Plaza, in the year 1905, and I could see all these newspaper articles. So stories that, people hadn't repeated over time and weren't in books anymore and had been forgotten because they were over 100 years old, I could now revive them. So one of the most amazing ones, and one of my favorite stories, was this story of the building of the Plaza and the actual construction of it, and how unions at the time were really in their infancy. And one of the few unions were these iron workers who essentially erected the steel skeletons that allowed us to have skyscrapers. They were absolutely critical for, the building of New York City the way we all know it. And, they were paid quite well because, they were union and they had these special skills. They would go, 8 stores up, and as you mentioned, throw hot metal at each other, and they were building these iron structures. And the Plaza, it was very expensive, so the Plaza hired some non-union workers to kind of do the simpler work down on the ground. And of course the union guys were very upset, and this was a rough and tumble time still, and so they started dropping this hot metal onto the heads of the non-union guys working down below, and it got pretty aggressive. And so finally the Plaza decided to hire some security guards to kind of keep the peace. Yes. And so there was this poor security guard walking around trying to stop any aggression, and these union guys threw him off the unfinished 8th floor of the hotel, and obviously he died. So yeah, it was a murder while the building was being constructed, and no one had written about it. At the time it was a really big deal, but it had been totally forgotten. And that was just, I thought it was so apropos, because also union and union issues really play throughout the history of the Plaza, throughout the 100 years. There always have been sort of these union tensions. So it really was illustrative of that and sort of foreshadowed that, but also just the fact that, it was a crazy story. A tragic, but crazy story. So
right. That was, yes, that's exactly what it was. And I think there were 3 of them in the beginning that you talk about. They were former police officers, maybe?
Yes.
There was
security. They were, security guards for hire, essentially. They were all beat up, but one of them actually was killed.
Yeah. But absolutely incredible. And that was something that, just stuck with me. But that idea of that, I think you referred to it as a ballet, when they were working with the iron and this molten, I can't even imagine being that high. No straps to hold them, no nothing.
No helmets. They were called cowboys of the sky because
Yes.
they were so, and they were tough, like crazy guys, throwing metal, like catching it, hammering, working with no nets, no safety harnesses, nothing. So
Amazing. Absolutely amazing.
And they were very violent, clearly.
Right. So we have a question. It says, Julie, did you have to assemble the notes section in the back of your book? It looks like a full-on headache.
I was very nervous about this. So before I wrote the book, I had really only ever written like newspaper articles. I had not really written anything even close to this long. So I was very concerned with, how I was going to go about it. So my editor gave me amazing advice that I used. And I don't know how, I know that Fiona was saying, she thanks, credits all the news at the end in the notes. I was, because it is nonfiction and, it was obviously you have to fact check everything. As I was writing the chapter, I basically would collect all my material for that era, for that chapter. And then as I was writing it, I would footnote in my Word document, essentially, everything. So I had all the articles. So it was all done. They were already footnoted when I went back, but they were complete. I did not know how to properly footnote. So the poor copy editor had to retype all those pages and reorganize where I put the titles and etc. But the material was all there. So
that is their job, but it sounds like you made it a lot easier than it could have been.
I have no idea how you would go backwards and try to find that. That would have been a disaster.
That would be a genuine nightmare, I think. But no, as I think it was Susie Schnell who asked that question, and she's right. You did a phenomenal job. It's impressive to see that list of notes. So Fiona, we talked earlier about the fact that the New York Public Library, the Lions of Fifth Avenue, came to you from an idea from a reader. How about the masterpiece about Grand Central or the Dollhouse, or any of your other brilliant books? Obviously you love New York. you love the architecture, but can you speak to us a little bit about your process?
Sure. You know, the first book was set at the Barbizon Hotel for Women, and that was really based off of an article that I wanted to write about the old-time residents who were living there. There were about a dozen of the old-time residents still there. And after they turned it into luxury condos, and they were all moved into rent-controlled apartments on the 4th floor. And I was so curious about what it was like when one of these ladies came out of her apartment that she's paying $200 for a month and runs into the guy who bought the $17 million penthouse in the elevator. And I just thought, well, that's such an interesting look at how the city and this building has changed over time. But the women are at that point were very private and they didn't want to be interviewed. And I just couldn't shake it. And I thought, you know, maybe I'll try and write a fictional account of something that happens there. And then I can make stuff up, because how hard can that be? Turns out it's hard. And that was the first book. And each book, it's been different. For Grand Central, I was offered a behind the scenes tour, which kind of opened my eyes to what that structure was about. For the Chelsea Hotel, I knew I wanted to write about 1950s McCarthy era Broadway actors and actresses. And the Chelsea Hotel just made the perfect fit for that, because it's been such a hotbed of political and artistic intrigue through the decades. So each one's been really different. And that's kind of nice. Like once I'm finishing edits on one book, I just start keeping my eyes open, and every time something's come to me, and every time I found some kind of nugget that I can play with there.
That's amazing. I'm wondering, part of the reason you wanted to write about that time period that you were just speaking of regarding the Chelsea, is it because you were acting at one point when you were younger?
Yeah. When I came to New York as an actress in my 20s and worked with a theater company where we put on plays, and you know, we did everything. We swept the stage, we hung the lights. One of our shows went to Broadway and was nominated for a Tony Award.
Nice.
And these are all my best friends still today. So it just was a really wonderful experience. And so that was helpful with that book, where I knew the shorthand already in terms of, you know, what it's like to move a play to Broadway, and what it's like backstage, and what the costume designer does and what the set designer does. And so that just gave me a shorthand into it, because the political elements of that book were pretty heavy. Mm-hmm. And there I really had to obey a strict timeline of what was going on in 1950 with McCarthy and the Korean War, and you know, red channels and all those kind of things. So that helped to be able to do that. And I noticed there's a question about the Columbia Journalism School in the question, and it says, I love this one. You attended Columbia School of Journalism. What do they think about your betrayal of them in your book? Have you heard from them? Pam, I'm wondering if you went there as well. Pam asked the question. And yeah, you know, as I started doing research into this book, I found, I reached out to the J School, and they said, oh, you should read this book on the history of it. And it's this incredible history that talks about when it first opened in the 1910s. It was co-ed, it was only 15% women, and about how the women went on a different track than the men. So the men were sent to cover murders or political intrigue, and then the women were sent to cover tenements or orphanages. And it talked about how there was one professor who would stalk the hallways looking for women who were doing immoral things, because he was convinced that having women in the student body was just, you know, a nightmare. So I drew on all these real things, because there was rampant sexism at the time, and the J School, you know, wasn't free of it. There was a lot going on. And there is a major thing that happens in the book that I did make up. But I'm pretty sure that the J School understands the difference between fiction and nonfiction. And just to show how things have changed over time, back when Laura goes to the school in 1913, it's 15% women. And today, the Columbia Journalism School is 75% women. So things have certainly changed.
And I guess, in my opinion, for the better, I'd like to say. Unfortunately, you know, these are realities. And I do think it's important that we speak of them, as opposed to pretending whether they're happening now or 50 or more years ago. I don't think it helps anyone to pretend or to hide. again, that's just my opinion. And I
Yeah,
hope.
I think it's very illuminating to see how things have changed or not over time. And yeah, we have made progress, but in what ways do we still have more to go?
Right, absolutely. Whether it's gender related, monetary equality, racial equality, whatever it is. That was a big part of the book for me, that was so important because of where we are right now. And I hope that Columbia respects the fact that you've done this, that you've included them in your book.
And in the author's note, I do mention that, I'm indebted to them. They taught me everything about how to read and edit and shape a story. And I'm on the board of visitors, so they can't say no.
Yeah, there you go.
I went to Columbia undergrad and grad, and I feel like they certainly welcome that sort of, they respect that, I will say that the Plaza did not authorize my work. And to this day, if you go, it's closed now, but if you go to the bookstore at the Plaza, you'll see many books about the history of the hotel, but you will not see my book there. So,
oh no, that's terrible.
Yeah. So some institutions are more amenable to criticism than others, I guess.
I would say so. So I hate to do this to you, Julie, but bringing up a touchy subject, considering the fact that Donald Trump once owned the Plaza, have you gotten a tremendous amount of publicity, negative, positive, anything you're comfortable speaking about?
It's interesting, I struggled with that. So when I actually interviewed Trump, as a reporter in the city, I don't think many reporters in the city hadn't interviewed Trump. So I sort of assumed, he'd be pretty accessible, and I didn't think he would be, winning the presidency when I was working on the book. So I was working chronologically. And of course, by the time I got to the 80s, he was in a very different position. So I struggled with how to approach it, because it's not a political book, and I didn't think that, that was necessarily the place, or the facts speak for themselves. The Plaza only went through one bankruptcy in its 115-year history, and that was, under Trump's ownership. So I don't really need to politicize it. It's factual. That was fine. If you look at my Amazon reviews, for some reason, the first one that comes up is, someone very upset that I was very anti-Trump in my book. So clearly, it's a touchy subject. But, I did actually end up focusing more on Ivana, because in many ways for that chapter, Trump was obviously, he was the owner, but Ivana was the manager. She was the president of the Plaza. She was the first and only time a woman has ever managed the Plaza. So to me, in some ways, that was a more interesting story. Her management, obviously their marriage was breaking up at that time, and much of it played out at the Plaza, and Marla Maples was being kept in an apartment right around the corner at the time. So all of that was taking place. But, I felt like, for the most part, I just tried to play it pretty straight. And that's how I mostly approach it now. And it seemed to work reasonably well. But some people think I'm anti, some people think I'm too pro. So
no, I think just so you know, I as a reader didn't see that you had a bias at all. I was more curious, because I do think people just assume, if you say something factual, if they know anything about you, they might assume that you have a bias against one of the people who owned the building. But it is interesting that it's sort of come full circle now.
Well, I mean, the truth is the thing that was such like almost an embarrassment of riches about the story of the Plaza is that every decade, what was happening at the Plaza was so reflective of what was going on in the city and the country at large
Right.
at that same time. So I just thought it was so apropos that, you know, at the height of the go-go 80s, sort of when Trump is at his most, you know, famous, you know, hanging out with Don King and you know,
Right.
going to all the like, you know, boxing matches in Atlantic City, you know, he buys the Plaza, he takes out a full page, you know, advertisement saying, I bought the Plaza, I overpaid, but it's the Mona Lisa, so I don't care. You know, it was just so Trump. And then, you know, and then for it to go through a bankruptcy sort of as the recession, the early 90s recession happened, and then really he paved the way for foreign ownership of the hotel, because the creditors essentially that took it over from the bankruptcy wanted to make as much money as they could, and it put the Plaza on a trajectory that it has never really recovered from. So I felt like, you know, in so many ways, it was kind of the perfect allegory for what was going on at the time.
Absolutely, I agree. I agree, absolutely. And I think you make that point very clearly in the book. We have a question for Fiona. Do you have a running list of other New York landmarks that you hope to write about in the future?
Yeah, you know, there's some that come up over and over, like the Flatiron Building and Carnegie Hall. And I'm open to suggestion, by the way. So if anyone has any ideas, throw them in the chat. And I find, you know, as I'm winding down on one book, I just start keeping my eyes open, and something tends to leap up. And so far, any building that I've approached, I haven't discarded. There's always been something worthy in its history that just kind of sparks a story idea, and I'm off and running. So it's a good place to, you know, people often ask me, would I do anything outside of New York? And I'd love to do something in London, you know, find a building there that's, you know, 1,000 years old, and do something like that. I think that'd be great. And then write off the whole trip. So that would be awesome.
Are there any?
I want to do that.
Right. Are there any specific buildings in London that you've considered already, or is it just that you have an affinity for the city?
You know, my parents are both English, and we'd go back there every 3 years to visit relatives, and we'd, you know, always stop at palaces and ruins and grand estates. So I think that's just something in my blood to want to dig into. I think that'd be fun.
I think it sounds terrific.
I have to say the Dorchester is an amazing hotel in London.
And the Langham too, the Langham Hotel. Oh,
so many good ones.
I know.
And Susie says, you two should pair up and come out with companion books, historical fiction and nonfiction about the same building.
Yes.
I agree 100%.
We've already, I don't know, Julie, you might not want to talk yet about what your next project is, but it's something that I would glom on in a minute.
Oh, well, let's talk. We should talk. I'm still like researching, but
yeah.
Yeah.
But that could be a fun one. We'll see. Stay tuned.
Okay.
Okay.
Susie, you can write the screenplay after.
There you go. Triple threat.
Great.
That's wonderful. So do we have any more questions from anyone? Okay. So I just want to make sure before we close up here that everyone knows you can purchase signed copies of both Lions of Fifth Avenue and the Plaza through Scattered Books. We won't let the rabbits near them, I promise. And you can always ring us at the store or email us or go on the website, because both Julie and Fiona have promised that they would sign books, and I need signed copies, please.
The Plaza makes a very good holiday present.
Absolutely, 100%, especially since we live so close to New York City. And I just want to thank both of you so very much for doing this evening. I know this year has been very difficult for everyone, but the fact that we were able to do this Zoom means a lot.
Oh, thank you so much for having us. This is just so much fun, and I'll chat with Julie all day if I could. So this was just marvelous. Thank you, and thank you everybody for joining us, and for supporting your local indie bookstore. It's so important that we all do that right now.
Thank you.
I couldn't say it any better than Fiona did. Thank you so much.
Thank you both. It was lovely. Good job.
Bye.